John Eicher is an associate professor of modern European history at Pennsylvania State University, Altoona. Today we'll be discussing his prize-winning dissertation turned book titled Exiled Among Nations, German and Mennonite Mythologies in a Transnational Age, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. So thank you for being here with me.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, very first question. How did you get into the field of history? What made you want to research Mennonites in Paraguay?
That's a great question. I didn't get interested in history until the last semester of my senior year of college at Goshen College, which is a Mennonite college. But I had a very inspiring professor, John Roth, and I had a class of his, and I thought, well, I'd like to do this. So the next year, I didn't have any real plans. I ended up selling cars and writing a 50-page article to test myself to see if do I really like history? Do I like writing? Do I like reading? Do I like research? And so in my evenings, I worked on that. It was never published, but I thought it was good. But it inspired me to then want to be a historian. So the year after that, I volunteered in Germany and worked on my German and wrote proposals and got accepted into grad school.
And so how'd you delve into the topic? Because, I mean, Mennonites are all over the world. You can talk
Yeah.
about the ethnic Mennonites or religious Mennonites. What made you zero in on focusing on like a comparative history of these two colonies?
Yeah. So I come from a Mennonite background, Swiss Mennonites. I grew up in a town called Bern, Indiana, just north of Geneva, Indiana. So there's, um, and I wrote a master's essay on how these Mennonites from Switzerland Americanized themselves, and they did it by embracing temperance and prohibition, which is very middle class American. And I didn't really know where I was going after I wrote that essay necessarily, and I, through reading, had learned about these Mennonites in Paraguay, sort of stuck out in the middle of the Chaco, and I read more on the Chaco War, and I thought Mennonite nonviolent people in the middle of a desert, in the middle of a war, this is pretty interesting. So that's what guided me into it. So they're Russian Mennonite, or from a Russian Mennonite background. These Paraguay Mennonites, I'm from a Swiss Mennonite background. I've learned many distinctions between the two culturally as I've gone into as I went into the topic, but that's what inspired me.
What are those distinctions? Because I think like the at someone I've read it somewhere like the Anabaptist disease of Mennonites constantly breaking, or Anabaptists in general,
Yeah.
breaking into different denominations, and then we kind of are at the living in the end point result of all these different breakups and then combinations. What do you think are the big differences between Swiss Mennonites, Russian Mennonites, besides the obvious ones of like language and history?
Yeah. Well, what's astonishing is just how similar they ended up being still after, centuries, how their cultures still more or less resembled each other, to the point where by World War One, World War Two, people could say, oh, I think we have something in common, or at least some people did. Some Mennonites. Distinctions, I think, my background, the Swiss Mennonites, much more closely tied to the Amish. Actually very closely tied to the Amish. There's Amish in my area. Pretty much most areas with German, Swiss Mennonite backgrounds in the United States also have Amish communities around them. So there's that tie-in. Definitely, I would say less worldly. I mean, you can keep going into further and further stratifications here, like between General Conference Mennonites and Mennonite Church USA. But anyway, the Russian Mennonites tended to be a little more politically sophisticated. A lot of them, at least those that stayed in Russia up until the 20s or so, once again, they have their own conservative liberal spectrum. A lot of it is, I think, big distinctions are our language, our relationship to the countries they lived in. The Russian Mennonites ended up being much more mobile. The Swiss Mennonites typically went from Switzerland to the United States and migrated within the United States, but point to point more. Russians went, uh, all across Northern Europe to Russia and then over to the Americas. So more
Yeah,
mobile, I would say.
and typically country to country, much more willing to move to a completely different country. Um,
Yeah, as it turned out. Yeah.
so, what was the hardest part of the research for this book? Um, I'm interested because when I interviewed Benjamin Goose, he also kind of talked. Oh, you guys kind of shared notes. Uh, so, like, how much contact did you have with him or other Mennonite historians, and how much note sharing was there going on?
Yeah, well, everyone I spoke with in Mennonite circles is always very helpful in pointing me in the right direction. And the secondary literature is so vast, I would say that there's a lot of just really amazing information out there about where to go, what to look for in different places. Hardest thing was maybe I don't know, getting funding to go to.
Mm,
I went to Canada, I went to Germany, I went to Paraguay. So you have to make that all possible. So the
right.
organization of that, I think, was perhaps the most, I think, trying or difficult aspect of it. I got to know Ben Goosen, I think, in about 2014 or 15. I'm not sure how I learned. It might have been through my advisor, Glenn Penny, that I learned of him. And so we got in touch. And I had been to the Auswärtiges Amt, the German Foreign Office in Berlin, and I had taken like a lot of notes on the documents there. So I shared those with Benjamin, and yeah, he gave me some useful information too regarding the more the Russian Mennonites, well, especially the German Mennonites, their longer history in the 19th century. So yeah, I think the mobility aspect was maybe the writing was easier than that.
Well, was there one part of the research that like kind of stood out that fit a bunch of pieces together, like an aha moment?
Was there what a piece of research? You're trying my memory now. Yeah, no, there. Well, conceptually, what really actually put everything together for me was a Canadian literary critic named Northrop Frye, who has what's called theory of modes, which he's he is he works on literature, English, and he has a book called The Theory of Modes, which talks about different ways that people organize stories or create stories, different narrative arcs, tragic, comic, ironic, etc. And through explaining that, I started to realize the way Mennonites tell stories about their migrations, their narratives, and they have actually really long trajectories. And in the case of some of my Mennonite groups, they see themselves within the story of the Bible. So the Bible itself is a story. It's filled with its own climaxes, rising action, climax, resolving action, tragic plot progressions and comic plot progressions, where something horrible is going to happen and then someone saves the day. It's a comic plot progression. Something where something horrible is going to happen and then it just ends up being horrible, like Hamlet. That's a tragedy. And the Mennonites, in their writings, in the way they're talking about their movements, they are making these exact kind of stories. So that's what made me want to focus on the stories that Mennonites tell about themselves and their groups. They might be moving all over the world, but they're following a narrative trajectory that they see mirrored in the Bible. So that's, yeah, what made everything kind of click for me.
So before you were doing research, like you didn't really have as much of a framework that you're
Yeah.
thinking about, and this kind of helped put all the pieces together.
Yeah, I didn't know how to organize because I was looking at two different groups of Mennonites. One conservative that went from Russia to Canada in the 1870s, then from Canada to Paraguay in the 1920s, and then another group that stayed in Russia till the 20s, left Russia through Canada or through China and then to Paraguay, and then from Canada to Paraguay. And so you have these people just, it's like herding cats. They're all over the world. So how do you bring them together? Because what I wanted to talk about is why don't they get along once they're settled in Paraguay? For the 30s and the 40s, they're just not really talking. Why? And what really put it all together was this narrative. They're literally living inside different stories. And that keeps them from recognizing any sort of similarity with a group that to the rest of the world says, you guys are the same.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's the theory of it. It brought that together. Northrop Frye, very, very good. Overlooked, very good.
What are the pros and cons of making a transnational study with like such a hemispheric focus? Because it's pretty sweeping. Like you're talking about like German state policies, MCC in North America, Paraguayan state. What are just the pros and cons of that?
Of like a transnational approach?
Right.
Yeah, the pros of this approach is that you don't get sucked into a particular narrative that is imposed maybe by a state, like a country. Like you're sort of, when you look at one people in one place, you sort of have these assumptions about their environment and about government policies and about government actions, and you're just there. And you don't know really how it might be if they were somewhere else or doing something else or had to move or whatever. So a transnational approach, actually, to go back to narrative, brings these groups and their narratives as they move around the world into conflict with other narratives, nationalist narratives, for instance, like German, like Canadian, Paraguayan. And so I think a valuable aspect of this approach is that you see all of these different stories colliding with each other as these groups move around the world. And some of them even pick up narratives from these countries, like the Russian Mennonites who ended up in Paraguay, who fled from communism in the 20s, and that second group that went to Paraguay, Russia, Germany, Paraguay, the Fahrenheit group. They picked up Nazism. Now, did they know what Nazism, like in all its gory, terrible detail was? A couple of them, I think, some of them had a fairly decent idea. A lot of them just thought, Germany's a very strong country. We're refugees. Maybe we can attach ourselves to Germany and Germany will bring us back to Europe and give us homes. You know, so it's very like selfish. For, you know, a selfish way, sort of like picking up that narrative to ride along with. So that's the advantage, I think, of a transnational study. It lets you compare things that seem to be very different or opposed or not relevant to each other. It brings them together, and you can find those connections.
Oh, are there any cons to it or any difficulties?
Yeah, there are, because you never really settle in one place and you never focus on one thing. So it can all end up feeling rather superficial in a lot of aspects. Like, I didn't really know too much about Paraguayan society or I mean, for that matter, Russian society necessarily, even Canadians. I mean, I'm a Germanist, I'm a Europeanist. So, like, especially in Canada, like, didn't know the bigger issues going on in, you know, across the breadth of Canada, or even with necessarily other Canadian Mennonites who might live in Ontario versus the groups I were looking at, which are in Manitoba. So you can sort of become, you can not see a lot of context that might be relevant if you're too transnational. Hopefully I didn't do that too much, but it could have happened.
That's kind of leading into my.
You can't do everything.
Yeah. That's kind of leading into my next question, which is like you explore all these different perspectives in the book. Are there any that you ended up leaving out that you wish you had, or that you didn't think about after the fact, or maybe there just wasn't enough space or time constraints so that you couldn't, like, you have a good information, like, I should include this, but I just don't really have
Yeah.
the time.
Oh yeah, there's about 100 pages. I mean, scattered, throughout. I wish I would have said or could have said a little bit more on Paraguay, because that is where they ended up, and the political situation there. I lightly included some of that, but this country's at war in Bolivia too, right? And they're fighting in the Mennonites' backyard, and I don't know much about the military policy, strategy, logistics, what was happening in Asuncion. That is one, I think, area that I do wish I would have had a little bit more. But they said, the editors say 300 pages, so
Mhm.
that's all you got.
So, what are the biggest differences between the dissertation and the book? Did you make like any major changes?
Cutting sections here and there. I didn't ever have to overhaul. I was very lucky and very glad I didn't have to overhaul any chapters in a major way. I went through and I found paragraphs I wanted to cut, sections, a lot of rephrasing and reframing certain sections within chapters. But you cross them all out, and then you try and tie everything back together after you've cut those things out. And I didn't do my own index. I hired someone to do that, which I am thankful every day of the week for. Lovely index. I could not have done. So it was a lot of loose ends, just loose ends throughout the book in terms of organization, maps, including maps. So it was a lot of small things, instead of like big whatever things.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Uh, so this is probably this. I think this is kind of one of the uh, core questions of the book, and it's a very big debate in Mennonite scholarship. Um, I think you framed it as like the Mennonite question at one point. I've heard it framed as the Mennonite ethnic wall. So,
Mhm.
very simple question, uh, probably a complicated answer. What does it mean to be Mennonite? Uh, how do you get at generalizing and specifying when necessary?
You can't. That's great. Mennonites are great because they're so slippery. They never sort of all agreed on one creed or one thing at all. There was always division. Whenever there was a question, there ended up about way to do something. There ended up being some sort of division. I don't. The idea of Mennonite Essentials was a project of the late 20th century. It was never a project of anyone before at least 1850 or so, I think. And so sort of trying to somehow retroactively read something onto a group of people that now has sort of thinks of themselves as connected is a little disingenuous to me. You could recognize things, between groups, similar last names, similar cultural artifacts, diets, and so forth between opposing Mennonite groups. The nonviolence, I think if there is one thing, it would be nonviolence that Mennonites, if you would say you're a Mennonite or an Anabaptist, you would agree with. There are obviously instances in Mennonite history where that was disregarded. But I just can't say there are essential things about, because there's no creed. There's just no list of things they ever all agreed on, really until the late 20th century. And even now you still have divisions there. So I think that makes it fun. I think that makes it interesting.
Then how do you get around the idea or the fact that like you see a lot of Mennonites in the Netherlands still doing charity support for Mennonites in
Mm-hmm.
Russia even earlier than 1850s. And so there is kind of still this kind of
Right.
connection
That's a
between,
good point.
yeah.
Yeah, that is a good point. And I'm not really too familiar with those instances, but uh, coming out of that Anabaptist traditions, you're right. There are moments, and especially after World War One, and especially after World War Two, where you had individuals or groups learn of individuals who are calling themselves Mennonites or Anabaptists somewhere else in the world, and because they had the capacity and the money and the interest, were able to organize relief and support for them. Um, Rogers Brubaker has a concept called moments of groupness. So instead of sort of statically seeing groups as always sharing some sort of affinity like nationalism or religion or ethnicity, instead they have moments where, for whatever reason, everyone comes together from some sort of provocative action. People come together and say, we belong together. We identify with each other. We are one thing. And just as often as not, then whenever that passes, they, go their separate ways or don't find to have as much in common anymore. One thinks the United States, September 12th, 2001, everyone in America was an American, or, at least most everyone. Now, 22 years later, doesn't feel so united in the United States, right? So that
Mhm.
moment of groupness then went somewhere, we transitioned out of it.
Yeah, dissipates it. Yeah, like so.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
times of it's kind of like a up and down timeline of cohesion and then dissipation.
Mhm.
Um,
And there's a larger narrative there beyond that moment, which is fascinating in and of itself. Between that, you have moment, you can connect those then. Well, why did that moment happen? What brought it there? What was the narrative that people were telling themselves that brought them into that? And then how did it go away? So once again, Northrop Frye sort of helps us understand how people live inside stories.
uh, so what then? Because you talk about the different narratives between Menno and Fernheim. I thought it would be an interesting comparison, and I wonder if you kind of considered this at all. If there was, if you could do a comparison between the Menno colony and then the Mexican Chihuahua colony, or the couple colonies there, to see if there is a difference and a distinction there. Because several scholars I've read say, well, the reason why Paraguayan Mennonites are successful is really because of the Fernheim colony, because they came from Russia, they
Yeah.
have kind of that experience. But then the ones in Chihuahua didn't have the economic motor of the Fernheim
Mm-hmm.
colony there, but they still became fairly relatively successful.
Yeah.
Um, so I wonder because you're talking about difference in mythologies. Would you say that the colonies in Chihuahua had the same mythology of the Mennonites in Menno colony, and that the breaking point, the change didn't happen until they went their separate ways to the two different states, or the fact that they chose different places might imply some different mythology?
Yeah, well, from what I know of the Mexicans, and here's where the transnational, I know of them, not really about them.
Right.
But uh, my understanding is that the Mennonites of Menno Colony who went to Paraguay in 1926 were the most, you could say, hardcore of all the groups that left Canada. They wanted a clause written into the actual constitution of the country they were going to that said, we don't have to fight. We can have our own schools. We can collect our own taxes, et cetera, et cetera. That is in the Paraguayan constitution. They could not get those same terms because they went to Mexico and they talked to the president, Obregon, I think, and they couldn't get those terms. They could get, I think, an amendment or a rider to the constitution.
It was a presidential
or
decree.
a president was a president. Okay, presidential decree. That wasn't good enough. So some Mennonites chose Mexico because obviously it's much more convenient and probably a lot easier to access markets than the Menno colonists. As far as Fahrenheim making Menno colony successful, I don't know. No one will ever know. I think the Mennonites of Menno colony were very much, settled, wanted to stay there. They would have made it work. Fahrenheim was more worldly. They had more interest in creating relationships with the Ascension, with the government, with business interests. So they certainly made it more of an economic motor. But yeah, I think Menno Colony was doing pretty good on its own before the Fahrenheimers showed up, and they knew it. And so when they came, when the Fahrenheimers came, the Mennonite colonists, I mean, they arrived. And it's just an odd story. They arrived on Easter, the Fahrenheim colonists at the railhead, and the Mennonite colonists were supposed to come pick them up in wagons, and the Mennonite colonists just let them hang out at the railhead for a couple days because it's Easter. It's Easter. We're celebrating. Sorry, we'll come later. And so I don't know where I was going with that, but they're not really getting along. So the Menno colonists don't really need them, or they're not like, oh, the Fahrenheim colonists are here. They're going to save us economically.
Mm-hmm.
So.
So you explore a lot about identity, like nationalism, ethnicity, religious identity, and like how it's in states of flux. And you talk about how it's always constantly negotiated with each different point of departure, or each different context. But I wonder how much of that is, well, how much would you say is implicit, where it's Mennonite leaders who, like you said, were probably genuinely believed in Nazism or had that affinity for Germany, and how much of it is more implicit, where people don't really think much about their own identity. It's just kind of something they're inculcated with. And so if you talked with them, it's like, well, what is your identity? They wouldn't even really understand the question. It was just, so much of it is implicit. And how does that tread with this idea of mythology, of having different stories? Like, can they have a different story? Is it just like an implicit story, would you say? Or how do you kind of get about that?
Yeah, right. I mean, humans live inside stories, large and small. If there's not a story, there's no human, basically. I mean, I have my own story about who I am in my life, and probably a lot of it's not even factually correct, but I feel that it is, and it's definitely made me the person who I am and informs all of my decisions about the world. And as a collective, big groups of people do the same thing. So I think, in terms, like if we're talking about mythology, there's history and there's mythology, and it's so frustrating when people get into arguments. Historians need to get the facts right, and they don't care who they upset, and they're going to cause a lot of division, and that doesn't really help unity. Mythologies are all about unity. Let's forget about the past or rework it to make it the way we want. Because what's important is that we have some sort of unity, and both are important, right? What would the Mennonites be if they didn't have any sense of unity? They just wouldn't be anything. And if they rely too heavy on totally historical understanding, they're just dredging up division, and then they find out we don't really have much in common. But if they rely fully on mythology, then they lose a lot of important things, like, oh, some of us used to be Nazis, right? Oh, some of us used to persecute indigenous people, right? And then you're just living off in La La Land that you're so great or exceptional or whatever. So we need both. As societies, as religions, as whatever, we need to be able to hold and distinguish history in its importance and mythology in its importance. Too many times we cross those. Now, that's my statement on history and mythology. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, so the question is trying to get at who makes the myths, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Right.
So
yeah. Well,
how much is it implicit? How much of it is kind of just an organic, just person to person kind of telling the story that aggregates? And how much of it is there's people at the top that are more concerned with controlling the narrative, I guess.
Yeah. That question I struggled with through the entire project, because what do we have? Well, we have some documents. Who are the documents generated by? Well, the documents are generated by leaders, white male leaders of these religious groups. Well, that's what we've got, right? And you have some diaries here and there, you have some reminiscences here and there, you have newspaper articles. Once again, the editor, who's he? Well, oh, he's a leader in the community. Okay. So that's what you have. So I kind of treated it as like, here's what the leaders are saying. They're getting enough people that either explicitly or implicitly agree with them to go along. Are they forced? Are they ostracized? Those are hard questions. I can't answer them. We don't know. So the way I talked about it was as groups, the Fahrenheit colonists, the Menno colonists, they are collectively making this decision. Now, there's a lot of leadership, there's a lot of power that is concentrated towards the upper echelons of that society. Parsing exactly how much power anyone has, it's so hard. So as long as they're going along with that story, that group story that is largely guided by white male leaders at the top, I'm saying they're part of the narrative. They're part of that narrative. And so I can talk about them within a narrative because that is true. They are within the narrative. So maybe it's sidestepping, but I don't know how to go further into it because everyone's now dead and we just have documents. And I think I've done my best at getting all the documents I possibly can.
This might be a little bit of a turn, but how can a transnational Mennonite network exist? All right, so I'm working off the assumption that there is a transnational Mennonite network.
Yeah.
That's it. That's how the MCC is able to function.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of how Mennonites travel between countries, going from colony to colony. They kind of create clusters around other Mennonites. Despite all their distinctions, there is kind of this Mennoniteness that they tend to cluster around. How can a transnational network exist when there's so much contestation with all the differing Mennonite mythologies that the smaller groups may maintain?
Yeah. Well, I think in really early instances of cooperation, like where the Dutch Mennonites helped the Swiss Mennonites, it was kind of specific. It was point to point. It was a smallish group of people helping another group of people. No sort of sustained action or institutionalized action. That comes about in World War I, and then in the with the establishment of MCC in the 20s, and then actually it was disbanded. Right, MCC was disbanded. It comes back together. So my understanding is Mennonite builders, maybe you could call them like identity builders, oftentimes talked about Mennonites as a global collective years, even decades before there was anything out there that even looked like it. Like in the 1890s, 1900s, Mennonites in Canada and the US are starting to think, hey, there's more of us out there. And they start talking about this global sort of like network of Mennonites. Did any of the Mennonites, average Mennonites, think of themselves like that? I don't think so. There are just a few movers and shakers at the top. So it's sort of like they're willing it into existence. Like with it mirrors nationalism, right? In the early 1800s, there are nationalist leaders in Europe, France, Germany, elsewhere. They're like, we need a nation, we need a nation, we need a nation. And they're saying this to peasants, and peasants shrug and they say, I don't speak French. I speak a patois. I don't want public education, right? And so there's Mennonites in the 1910s, 20s, 30s who just say, I don't get it. Why should we have an international network? And I think after World War II then, as MCC really comes out strong after World War II in being able to relocate refugees from Europe, an economic boom in the United States and Canada. There's a lot of money. There's a lot of interest in building institutions. There's money to fund it. And it's then that you see the full flowering of this idea that Mennonites around the world are connected and have been forever. even though that's not really true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where you get the idea of like Mennonite Essentials and Harold S. Bender talking about, this Anabaptist vision,
Right.
the vision projected on the past more so than really describing the past. Yeah.
I'm going to push back on one particular point because I think everything you've said is 100% true. And I think that's much more in terms of Mennonite as maybe a culture or the religious aspect. But there is like a very particular aspect that I've noted in traveling to a bunch of different places. I think you probably will know what it is. What is the Mennonite game?
Oh yeah.
Have you heard of that?
Right.
All right, so
Oh
just
yeah.
quickly, can you explain? So, what is the Mennonite game, real quick?
The Mennonite game is name the Mennonites you know or the places they live in, and let's try and find someone that we know in common.
So,
and
yeah, I talked
yeah,
with Dr. Goosen about this. He had his own answer, but then my question when I was reading this book is, well, if it's all just kind of a form of nationalism, or not quite, but it's similar in terms of it's a mythology that's created. How does that square with this idea that there are genuine kinship networks that you can even play this Mennonite game?
yeah,
And he had his answer, but I'm interested to hear what you had to say.
Yeah, well, like just looking at the Mennonite and Fahrenheim colonies, they don't get along, right? They don't want to have any association with each other, but hey, they share similar last names. Some of them are even related to each other, a lot of them. And so there you have a family kinship network that shares a similar language, culture, food, family ties, etc., but they don't really want to associate with each other. And I think they could still play the Mennonite game, but they still, I mean, at least the Menno colony would be fairly distrustful of fairly distrustful of the Fahrenheimers, even if they were able to play that Mennonite game. But I think the Mennonite game in other instances does draw people together. I know stories of, people moving halfway around the world, they find a Mennonite there, and that Mennonite helps them find an apartment and a car, and maybe they leave their kids with them for a couple days. So in different places at different times, the Mennonite game may function or not in terms of trust building.
Okay, interesting. Because I'm kind of working with the assumption that one of the aspects of why Mennonites are successful in different places is their transnational network. And in long distance network, currency is trust. So there's lots of different ways to build bonds of trust. And
what?
Yeah.
Oh no, I think it would be interesting to ask the question, because we're talking about different areas. Would a Mennonite in Canada trust the financial decisions and acumen of a Mennonite in Paraguay, even if they don't trust their reading of scripture? It's possible they would, right?
I would argue yes, in terms of when you look at financial aid, lots of most of the loans and capital that Mennonites in Paraguay were able to kind of accumulate comes from Swiss Mennonites or Russian Mennonites in Canada that had that break, that are very distinct. But then they hear about there's a need of Mennonites in Paraguay, and they take up a collection and they send a loan at a very low interest rate. And you see that with lots of Swiss Mennonites, lots of Russian Mennonites in Canada, for Mennonites in Mexico, Paraguay, Belize, having these interesting care packages as well of tools and things like that, based solely on essentially a name and kind of an assumption of a tie for kinship or religiosity.
So trust might be present in one area of life and not present in another area of life. I think that's probably fair to say.
So that's pretty much most of my questions, except like three other questions. So one, kind of selfishly, I'm interested in your how your answer for this, for my own curiosity and my own dissertation, is how would what are the main factors, would you say, for Mennonite success? And by success, I just mean uh, a disproportionate impact on the economy, which
Mm-hmm.
Mennonites seem to make everywhere they go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think they're generally very hardworking. They save money instead of spending money. Um, they don't take financial risks, I think, as much, risky loans and so forth. Um, I think that I think, and they have networks like we're talking about. I mean, conservative Mennonites in Canada and Paraguay and Mexico, they get along with each other and they can lend money, they can help each other. Those kinship networks are really important, in addition to sort of those Protestant ethic sort of values. Um, I think it's a culture. It's a culture of, the thing is, and there's not, Mennonites don't ever sort of go above or beyond, sort of like exceptionally, phenomenally wealthy, right? When they come in, their community has an impact, a big economic impact, but it isn't like, it's sort of the community that's having it instead of like one or two, and maybe I'm wrong here, I don't know, that are just exceptionally wealthy and they're sort of the big movers and shakers. It's a very communal, it feels like a very communal economic advancement wherever they are. Yeah, that's what I'd say. I was also going to just say, like, the Mennonites are funny because they'll say, we're going to leave society, we're going to go out, to the steppe or the, the plains of Canada. We're going to get away from it all. We're going to stay away from government. But then they're really good farmers and they want to sell their grain. So what do you need? You need a railhead, you need roads. Oh, okay. So you start doing this, and the economics always drags you sort of back in touch with the metropole and then like 40 years later, you look up and you're like, wait a minute, we've got public schools, on the side of these roads. We got railroads bringing in all sorts of shady characters we don't like to this community. We need to leave. So you go to a new wilderness and now, sort of repeat the same thing. I don't know. Their success sort of drives them into the national economy. And then once they're there, they're like, we like the national economy. We just don't like national, like schooling and, society and culture, et cetera. So.
Yeah, Dr. Royden Lowen has a nice turn of phrase that I'm going to butcher because I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's something like, the Mennonites use the world to escape from the world. Something like using the economic capacity to allow them to have kind of mobility around the world.
Yeah, and they seem to be running out of places. I mean, the world is only so big. So I don't know. The next 50 years, 100 years is going to be very interesting. Are they going to keep being able to stay in rural areas? Or, I mean, in where I'm from in Indiana, Mennonites are, when land is $18,000 an acre, you're not going to, and you have 10 kids, you're not going to set them each up with a 40-acre farm. You just can't do that. So they're getting sucked into local economies as tradesmen, builders, et cetera. And it'll be interesting to see, at least that's happening in places in the United States, if that happens also in Paraguay and other places around the world.
Yeah, Mennonites on Mars, man. They're going to be some of the first colonists.
Elon Musk, Mennonites for Mars.
Yeah.
They could do a collaboration.
So I thought it was interesting that both you and Goosen, and I don't want to like constantly be like just putting you in the same bag, but I feel like it was just interesting that both he's kind of now doing this work on like scientific networks and environmental history, and then you're doing work on like disease and the Spanish flu and that kind of moment. I'm kind of assuming that you probably had some influence on the parallel between COVID and the Spanish flu, and maybe you decide to study that, but maybe not, because it seems like people who study Mennonites as a transnational group also tend to be interested in other things that are transnational, such as disease, such as human capital or scientific innovation spreading elsewhere. So, how did you get on this topic of disease? And am I right?
Yeah, so funny. In 2018, I got a grant to go to Paraguay to study Germans in Texas, and because it seemed like an interesting space. There's Germans, there's Texans, there's Americans, there's Mexicans, there's Comanches, there's Apaches, there's a war, there's immigration, But then I got into the archive, the GSTA PK in Berlin, and realized I could not read Old German script. That's a different language. That's not German. I mean, it is, but it's not. So I was feeling demoralized, went home talking to my wife, Julia, and I don't know, we just started talking about it. It was 2018, 1918. I thought, you know what, maybe there is, something in the archive about the 1918 flu. So I did, and I went, and it was there. And there was this huge collection of documents. 5 people had looked at them in 15 years. I thought, oh, well, there's a story here. So that's how I got into it. And I thought, even if I was like 2018, well, it's not even going to be relevant because it's already past 100 years by the time I ever published it. So, and then COVID came along in 2020.
Little did you know, yeah.
Little did I know, it was very relevant. So I was able, it was just luck, but I was able to sort of ride that into, some good opportunities. And so now I've been more interested, I've been sort of pulling back from the transnational. I feel like my generation of scholars for the past 15, 20 years or so sort of grew up in the historical profession, like the transnational was the thing, the focus. Finding these connections, making connections, seeing how different groups relate and interact and exchange. And I think then going into this new project, I have 1,000 letters from Europeans across 10 different countries, or memories, and pretty much all of them agree that they didn't know this was a pandemic. They didn't know this was a transnational pandemic. They thought it affected their town, maybe the area around their town, maybe their region, maybe even their country. A couple even maybe Europe, right? But they don't have this pandemic knowledge. And on this side of COVID-19, that's astonishing, right? Because we would think, oh, it's global, right? It's a global pandemic. Mm-hmm. And they didn't. So I've gravitated more towards trying to, the concept of translocal, which I know already has the trans in it, but comparing different localities experiencing the same phenomenon and how are they similar or different. I think the flu has just too often been assumed to be global, assumed to be transnational, and because you have a world war, you have empire, right? You have global empires, you have global trade, high point of globalization, 1890 to 1914, right? It's always written about in the literature. This is globalization 1.0. But in some areas of knowledge, like health knowledge, medicine, etc., not transnational, not at all. This is local. No one's blaming refugees. No one's really blaming too much foreign countries. I mean, there's some instances, a lot of it's actually from the government blaming other countries. Average people, this is a local disease, one among many, actually. We have a lot of disease here at the end of World War I. So that was a wake-up call to me. It's still transnational in a way, but I'm more interested in rurality and locality now, I think, than I was with my first project.
Do you know, like, just based off this your brief delve into that research, like at what point was it kind of included in like historiographies where people were talking about it as a global event of the Spanish flu of 1918?
Right. Okay. Some caveats are in order. Elite medical doctors, researchers, professors, etc., in the United States, in the UK especially, they know it's going to be global. They know it is global. Even, I would say in London, in the United States, in certain metropolitan areas where you have good access to global news, there are people that do know it's spreading around the world and it is a global pandemic. Uh, in in Europe, not really, because there's bigger things going on. There's the end of the war, there's the armistice, there's the Bolshevik Revolution, there's revolution in Germany, and by the way, there's not really paper, right? Newspaper shortage. So if there is news, there's less space to print it in, and if there's a pandemic, 50% of all journalists and delivery people and readers are sick. And the other 50% are looking after that 50%. So when you really break it down and start looking into how are people becoming aware, could people become aware of this, start to realize that they're not, and they couldn't really be aware of it at all anyway. And certainly, and I don't know about the United States yet, but in Canada and other places that would have had access to, that would have been at peace and access to global news, I'm not sure, but at least in Europe, it really would have only been medical elites, government elites that would have had that knowledge.
That was at the time, but also I'm asking, at what point did it become a historical event where it became a part of kind of like this mythology that people talked about of the Spanish flu?
In the medical profession, it was published on. There was interest. The medicine side, the scientific side, there has been a steady interest in the Spanish flu from 1918 on. Vast literature, a lot of conversation. In history, in culture, etc., right? It doesn't really become interesting again until the 1970s. There's a 1957, I think, flu outbreak, and 1967 one, avian flu, I think it was. But then in the 70s, it might have even had to do with the eradication of smallpox and other achievements of medicine, that people started to look back at this, right, really a black eye for the medical profession. Like they didn't even know it was a virus, right, in 1918. And start to sort of reevaluate, and there's new interest in this massive pandemic flu that killed 50 to 100 million people. So that's when it really entered back into the popular culture. And people knew about it, yeah.
So last question for the podcast, and then maybe I will ask a couple questions about your experience in Paraguay separately from my own going in there for research. What is one book you'd recommend everyone should read in your field of history, either transnational history, Mennonite history, or now history of diseases, besides your own books?
I'd say Northrop Frye's Theory of Modes, as I plugged earlier. And is it even called Theory of Modes? Or is that just one second. It's called Anatomy of Criticism. I'm sorry. It's called Anatomy of Criticism, published in 1957. That and A History of No Place or Nowhere, A History of No Place by Kate Brown. A beautifully written book that talks about national indifference, peasants basically living in what was called the Crecy, this area between sort of Poland or Polish-speaking Europe and Russia in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s. Just beautifully written and just well executed. A History of No Place.